right, welcome back to Unit 3, Part 4. In this unit, we'll discover some of the dance music of the 1970s, putting them loosely into a couple different categories, and an iconic rock band that was so huge in the 70s and 80s, and actually huge fans still as of today, that will probably end up in very many future rock history textbooks, not unlike the Beatles and the Stones and some of the other iconic bands of an era before them. But let's move on first to some of our dance music. So we have them roughly in two categories, funk and disco. There is a little bit of a gray area here because there are funk bands that have a clear funk background and utilize some of the iconic musical elements of funk music that will occasionally record a disco song. Disco tends to be the more commercial side of dance music of the 70s. It's marketed towards a much broader audience, and it tends to have certain iconic elements to make it more appealing to everyone. And we'll talk about some of those as we march forward. All right, we're going to start with Mr. Brown here, who we've actually visited before in our section on soul. He's one of the godfathers of soul. And he changes his sound pretty dramatically by 1967 and onward to incorporate heavy amounts of percussion. He utilizes his whole band, all instruments used percussively, horns, electric guitars, electric basses, of course the drum kit, and even his voice in many instances becomes very short bursts of incredibly rhythmic percussive things. One of the other terms on the slide is syncopation. That roughly is emphasizing the in-between beats of a pulse that goes by, what we call the weak beats of music. It's been around. We haven't talked about it in too much detail. It's all over popular music. It is also a hallmark of jazz in particular. James Brown, I don't know if invented is the right word, but really created this emphasis on the first beat of every rhythmic pattern. Remember from our 12-bar blues, we call the organization of rhythm measures or bars. And so he emphasizes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. A very strong emphasis on the first beat also tends to give us a danceable something where we can, tap our foot down to every time we hear it. The song Cold Sweat really exhibits a lot of his funky qualities. So take a moment to listen, pause and go listen and come on back. What I mean by the first JB song, James Brown, it's the first with a distinctive drum solo. He is widely known of having had the funky drummer, who is Clyde Stubblefield, who will be name-checked later on in history by some very important hip-hop acts. In the James Brown slide, there's this blue One Nation video. You're not able to click on a film recording like this of that video, but I will put a link to it in your Unit 3 section of Canvas. It's a YouTube video that's pretty good about explaining some of the basic origins of funk, and I usually in class would play it up to about the Sly and the Family Stone section. You're welcome if you have the time to watch the whole thing. I'll put it's just a YouTube clip there. So pause, come on back, and we will continue with some funk. Okay, on to our next group. I gave you a little teaser of who it's going to be. Sly and the Family Stone, another important multiracial and multi-gendered band of the time, starting again in the late 60s with some interesting music, dealing with some social commentary in some of the music, songs that dealt with how ridiculous it is how we categorize each other in all these different ways. Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself is not your teacher not knowing how to spell on the titles page here. That is truly the sort of tongue-in-cheek way that Sly was spelling the lengthy title, kind of playing along with sort of ghetto language or Ebonics, I guess we can call it. It definitely fits in the funk category. Sly is the gentleman in the middle here. But it's very unusual for this early in rock history, particularly the late 60s, to have multiracial and multi-gender members of the group. And actually, some of them are not even pictured in this one. Here's that term polyrhythms I mentioned before. Poly means many, and then we add rhythms, so we have many rhythms happening simultaneously, and they're different. That's what makes polyrhythmic music so fascinating and sometimes difficult to play. It comes directly out of African music. African communal music is often very polyrhythmic, and he does it in many ways in the band. In this particular song, the guitar, the electric bass, and the drums all have slightly different rhythms, and even occasionally keyboards do. Something we'll see in some funk music, and not necessarily across the board, and in some disco actually, is not a big complex harmonic palette. The chords are not going to be changing tons and tons and tons. This is an emphasis, again, kind of on our rhythmic complexity, and you add too many complex elements to any kind of popular music, you're going to kind of exclude a lot of listeners who get very put off with it being too complicated. He was enormously influential on the development of funk. He had struggled later in his life, and I read recently that he did just get a settlement in the last about 5 years, and hopefully that will help him get back on his feet. But really important, influential person is Sly and the Family Stone. So pause and come on back. All right. This is some fun music to listen to. I always enjoy this part of lecture time. Another important African American media that was rising to popularity in the 70s is the subgenre of film called blaxploitation. And without giving you an entire history of film in the United States, it's a mixture of a genre called exploitation films, but it features heroes and anti-heroes, positives and negative ethnic qualities of the African American community. It was both loved and hated. It was stereotypical, and yet also provided some of the first all-black casts for films of the time. So it is very controversial in that it divides even the African American community and how they feel about it. Some didn't like the over-stereotyped characters. Others found empowerment in seeing people of their communities and who they identified with on the screen for the first time. Why it was important for music is that it featured African American composers in a variety of styles, but they fit loosely into our funk category here. We have Curtis Mayfield, who was part of a vocal group very famously well known in the 60s, who writes and performs the title track and the soundtrack for a blaxploitation film called Superfly. This particular soundtrack is later on sampled by all kinds of hip-hop artists. And one of the fascinating parts of studying early hip-hop and second generation and third generation hip-hop is how it reaches to the past history within its own origins and really name checks people and samples things for very important cultural purposes. And that's usually why Superfly is sampled. Plus, they're pretty good grooves. It's pretty good music. The next artist is Isaac Hayes, who won an Academy Award for his original song for Shaft, which is also in the category of blaxploitation films. He is the first African American to win this honor. That's a really important element. There are some parts of the theme from Shaft that have more leanings into disco. I think you might find scholars arguing about whether the theme from Shaft is a disco song or a funk song, and this is a good example of sort of those gray areas. You notice I don't have the genre put in the slide, and I always stick to the slides if we have the issue for our quizzes. But most people lump them together primarily because of their connection to blaxploitation films. So take a listen to Superfly. It's a little more rhythmic in some ways than the theme from Shaft. Maybe take a moment to compare the two and come on back, and we've got a little bit more funk before we go fully disco on ourselves. Welcome back. Before I move off of the blaxploitation slide, I want to make a little disclaimer. Some of the films are fairly violent. Some of them are highly sexual, so for those that find that mildly offensive, just a warning. It's a fascinating genre to examine. One of the biggest collectors and researchers and experts, actually, on blaxploitation films was Tupac. He was actually had a huge library of films that he had collected. His mother, before her passing, is featured on a very important documentary about blaxploitation films and talking about Tupac's knowledge and fascination with the genre. So if you want more, you can go in that direction. All right, a little bit later funk. Notice this song is from '76. And by this time in dance music history, disco was massive and huge. And we'll discuss why those years, 75, 76, are very, very big for disco. Blaxploitation films utilize a little bit of both, as I mentioned before. And then there are gray areas where you might find Sly and the Family Stones as a song that's more disco-y, technically, than funk. You know, people argue till the wee hours of the morning about these categories. George Clinton, who was the gentleman with his arm in the air here, let's see if I can draw around him a little bit. There he is. Was an interesting, intelligent, funny, diverse individual. He's still with us. He hasn't passed away. He was paying very close attention about how this crazy music business worked, and he's used it to his incredible advantage. By the '70s, he's created a couple of different bands. One's called Parliament, and the other one is Funkadelic. Both have many, many members. Both have images that they would portray on stage. One was more of a horror vibe, the other one was more of a outer space alien kind of vibe, and then they would often get on stage together. It was just this massive big party of people on stage. He knew that by having multiple bands, sometimes with the same individuals here and there, he knew that by highlighting individual players like Bootsy Collins was his great bass player, and giving him recording sessions individually, that it was more money in the bank. He was very, very, very smart about the business in that way. By '76, he's in many cases poking fun at disco in some ways, but also learning from the electronic instruments that they highlight. This is a Parliament song. It isn't truly Parliament Funkadelic combined, but it's a really important one because it is also sampled by a lot of rappers and hip-hop artists later on. It has what's called interlocking rhythms, meaning the two rhythmic patterns rely upon each other to create the bigger whole of a more complex rhythmic element. And these are pretty dense pieces of music, so they're a little hard to hear minutia, really microscopic kind of things. Here's that word syncopation again. He uses an electric bass line, sometimes in a keyboard and sometimes with an actual electric bass guitarist like Bootsy. There's a lot of call and response. What George Clinton knew and the artists of Parliament and Funkadelic knew is if you get the party going, everybody needs to be able to chant your song. This is the album. This appeared off of the Mothership Connection. There's a lot of Black empowerment in the music of Parliament and Funkadelic. And here's that crowd participation, really critical for Clinton's work here. So take a pause, listen, and maybe you'll feel like dancing, and come on back and we'll keep going forward. All right, hope you enjoyed some of that funk. Good stuff. So we get firmly into disco. Some argue who's the first of everything, and we don't always have an answer for that. The scholars of the history course debate this stuff forever. But Donna Summer definitely was one of the queens of disco. Disco is a very complicated style, but intended to reach the broadest audiences possible. It's one of the categories in what's called corporate rock. Corporations now owning recording companies, wanting profits over content, some will argue, pushing the bottom line, spreadsheets and things like that. And disco seemed to be, once it got very popular, a way to cash in, to make a lot of money really fast, because people loved it for the time of frame that it was at this height of its popularity, which is the second half of the '70s. and bought it, and tons of records, tons of tapes, tons of albums. But it really has a more rich origin going back to European electronic exploration, and particularly Eurodisco, which is this word right there. One of the big producers, very famous, is Giorgio Moroder. There is his name right there. I like my little red pen. Who was very innovative in the early use of electronics and sequencers and the whole production quality. And he worked with Donna Summer, who had an incredible vocal resume. She's done everything from gospel to the most current sounds. So it's really that combination of incredible talent that created her particular flavor of disco. How does it differ from funk? And that's the complicated part. It tends to, and I'm making a grand generalization in this category, have a very consistent beat. It tends to be very common in a lot of disco. That's what I mean by insistent, unrelenting beat. That does not mean the music is bad. I really have great respect for Donna Summer personally, because she really went through some difficult things and incredible as an artist. Her voice is off the charts. But there is some that criticize that regular beat of disco as being a little bland and a little dull. Disco has also been described as the music of alienation of the 1970s. People were drugged out of their mind, usually on something like coke, dancing the night away just to get away from the problems of our world. And we had a bad recession in the 70s. We had a lot of problems economically with unemployment. Because of that, we also had a president who resigned. So it was a bit of a bummer time for a lot of people in the 70s. I say her music is more musically complex than most disco because it is, because of that connection to Eurodisco and Giorgio Moroder, and just that she had a little higher demand for the product that she put out. When we see interesting things in disco is the first time the BPMs, beats per minute, become very important, because you're playing this music largely at first in big dance clubs like Studio 54 in New York City. And the DJ playing that music doesn't want to transition or segue from a very high beat song to a very low beat song and completely crush the mood of the dance floor. So being able to determine pretty quickly those beats per minute so that hopefully good DJ knows how to segue properly from one to the other was really important. And we see the emphasis of BPMs over just general tempo markings in music for the first time in the disco category. So listen to Donna Summer's Bad Girls and come back. All right, get our dancing shoes on. So these are the guys of the kings of disco, I guess one could say. In '76, an important film comes out called Saturday Night Fever. That is the story about a disco dancing guy and the troubles and things, working class gentleman person who has lots of interesting things that goes on in the film. But dancing to the clubs in New York City is a huge hallmark, and it's John Travolta as the star. And one of the many groups that provided the soundtrack was the Bee Gees. The B and the G stands for Brothers Gibb, and they are all brothers. They actually have a fourth brother who was a solo artist. By the early days of disco, the big cities really were the hot spots. Miami, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans. But the middle of the country could care less for this crazy disco stuff until a movie like Saturday Night Fever comes out. You might have had a farmer in Iowa who could care less about disco, and by the time this movie swept the country, and it really did sweep the country, you had farmers in Iowa wearing the white suits and the black shirts and doing the stances and the dances as well. So this movie really, really propelled disco to a whole different level. They're known for their incredible harmonies, especially when you grow up with singers in a family. You have that wonderful tight relationship. They use a type of vocal singing called falsetto, which is the very high range of a voice, whether it's male or female, but we really hear the difference in male voices. And the idea and the themes of the song are that dancing can alleviate your troubles. Dance the night away, kind of enforcing that music of alienation that I mentioned before. So listen to the great Bee Gees and come back, please. All right. One of our last disco groups is Chic. Important group because their song, Good Times, at least the instrumental section, will be sampled by a very early hip hop group without permission, actually, and we'll discuss that in Unit 4 for a little bit. But this is our introduction to the song Good Times as a disco song. They have the synthesized strings. Synthesizers by the late 70s are finally shrinking. They're finally becoming slightly more affordable. They're not as affordable as they'll be. I think it's 83 we get the Yamaha DX7 synthesizer, which is that every 80s song seems to have that sound in it. They have some influence from Cuban music and the bass. You see that in this bullet point right here. And again, the harmonies aren't as rapidly changing. That's what I mean by avoiding resolution, because the sense we want to go on, we can dance forever. And if you come back to your home chord, you have a sense as a listener, even though we may not understand it if we're not musicians, oh, well, that means we're near the end. If you don't ever give that home chord, you get this, I can dance forever. It's avoiding resolution. That's what that creates. So the group that will sample it is the Sugar Hill Gang, and we'll talk about them in Unit 4 in particular. And a lot of this music, as I mentioned before, particularly funk, but a lot of disco was also sampled by a variety of artists in hip hop and rap. So listen to some Good Times by Chic and come back. Fun music. All of it music is really fun. So the band I mentioned at the beginning of part 4 of Unit 3 that hugely filled arenas, that was an iconic rock band. It's hard to put them in a category because they pushed envelopes in so many ways, incorporating classical operatic elements in their music. Incredible, almost glam, I call it glitter rock to stay in connection with our textbook and materials because of the frontman's theatrics on stage, Freddie Mercury. This is the band Queen from England. I almost don't have to say much anymore because Hollywood did such a great job with the film Bohemian Rhapsody, but I can't assume that we've all seen it. So if you haven't, it's very good. I don't have any problem going out on a limb and making that personal endorsement. There's always fear when Hollywood tries to tell a story about real people and real events. One of the failures was the movie The Doors, and I actually enjoyed The Doors years ago when it first came out, but then reading what the actual living members of The Doors said about it, I could understand why they were frustrated with some of Oliver Stone's license that he took with their story. But Bohemian Rhapsody did a great job, and Rami Malek as Freddie Mercury was pretty incredible. They are sometimes called an arena rock band because they are in the number of record books for some of the largest audiences ever, particularly at Hyde Park in England. They have more heavier rock sounds than a lot of traditional glitter rock or glam rock bands would have had. But the strutting around on stage and the capes and some of the outfits that Freddie wore put them a little bit in that category. A Night at the Opera is the album that features the iconic tune Bohemian Rhapsody. There's a very good documentary. I don't know how easy it is to find, but it's called The Making of A Night at the Opera. And I am bummed that we are not meeting in person for this one because I love to show clips from that in class. But if you have the opportunity to find it, it's not required. You shouldn't have to purchase it, but it is very interesting, especially for those who are musicians as well. This song is everywhere, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I love it still, even though I've heard it 100 million times at this point. It's been used in other movies, Wayne's World, cartoons, TV commercials. It's such an iconic song. There's a new term I don't think we've gone over musically. A cappella is actually 2 separate words. It means no accompaniment. It's a term used for voices. So in the very beginning, before anybody enters, and it's just Freddie's voice, that's a cappella. The idea of antiphonal choruses, ooh, we're getting fancy terms here, is imagine yourself in a cathedral and you have a balcony on either side of you, and up on one balcony is a group of voices, a choir, and on the left balcony is another choruses. Those are antiphonal choruses. It was very popular in a cathedral in Venice called St. Mark's. Gabrieli used horn sections like that back in the Baroque time period, with horns in the right and horns in the left, and you have this wonderful collection of sounds. Well, Queen did that. They used the studio to do it, and they overdubbed themselves a bunch of times, but they created that wonderful antiphonal choir kind of sound to this huge epic song. So enjoy some Bohemian Rhapsody and make yourself smile, and that should wrap us up. I'm not going to ask you to pause and come back. I'm just going to wrap us up. So we are done with Unit 3. I will see everybody in Unit 4, and best of luck on your quizzes, and stay safe.